am extremely happy to introduce to you Ilaria Dagnini Brey, who is going to talk to us about Mantegna. Ilaria was born in Padua. She lives now in New York with her family. She studied at the University of Padua and then classics and then in England. She worked for several publishers like Rizzoli, Marsilio, grazie. And she wrote for the Corriere della Sera, Elle, and she translates, she writes books, she writes articles. She's a wonderful person to have around to talk about Mantegna and other projects that she's going to be involved with. So thank you, Ilaria, for coming.
Thank you all very much for being here. Thank you so much to Ernesto and Alessandra Mazzucato, who are wonderful friends. Ernesto helped enormously with, we would have had no pictures without his help, and my husband's. And Alessandra for asking me about a year and a half ago to come and talk to you about the current state of ritual restoration that she knew I've been closely following. When we spoke, I was here in Princeton at the Firestone Library, reading Ernest de Waal's papers. Ernest de Waal, as many of you probably know, was a professor of art and archaeology here in Princeton for many years. He was also, for a brief period of his life, the director of a commission for the protection of monuments in Italy during World War II. This was a small commission that was created very hastily when it became clear that Italy would become a theater of war. It was approved by President Roosevelt, and de Waal and his men went into Italy with the Allied army and did first aid work on damaged monuments that had been damaged. They surveyed them and worked in conjunction with the Italian finance authority. It was in his capacity as director of this commission that de Waal once wrote from headquarters in 1945. It is amazing what Italian experts can piece together from what appears to be just a pile of smashed rock. The story that I'm going to tell you tonight is about a pile of smashed rock. On the 11th of March of 1944, at 11:45 a.m. on a clear day, Padua, which is a city in northeastern Italy, was attacked from the air by 111 American B-17s, which dropped 325 tons of bombs. This was the fourth of 5 attacks on Padua. The aim of the raid were the marshalling yards and the nearby train station in Padua. As you know, Padua was at that time, in early '44, in German hands, and the objective of these raids was to cut off supply lines, roads, railroads, bridges. In the vicinity of the train station were also the military headquarters, which were very unfortunately located between the church, the Arena Chapel, also known as Caveni Chapel or York Chapel, and the church of the Eremitani, inside which was the Ovetari Chapel. The parish priest of the Eremitani had asked the German military authorities to move their headquarters because of the risk that they posed to these two monuments, to no avail. During that air raid, Giotto was spared and Mantegna was destroyed. 2 bombs hit the church of the Eremitani, one destroyed the upper part of the facade. The second dropped in the middle of the Ovetari Chapel and destroyed the frescoes by Mantegna. The destruction of the Ovetari Chapel was the worst artistic loss suffered by Italy during the war. It was worse than the Church of the Camposanto in Pisa, whose roof was burned but was eventually reconstructed. Worse than the Tempio Malapistiano in Rimini, which, if you see it today, you would never believe that it was ever destroyed. The Ovetari was considered lost completely. The immediate aftermath of the bombing was a sad scene of looting and volunteering happening at the same time. The director of fine arts for the area of Venice managed to be there within 2 hours of the bombing. There was also a group of local artists led by Paolo De Poli, who was a painter and a sculptor who made beautiful enamel vessels. He was also a teacher in a nearby art school, and he enlisted the help of students to pick up the pieces of the fragments of this chapel. They made makeshift boxes with the pews, with what was left of the pews of the church, and put these fragments inside the boxes. The boxes were sent to, at the end of the war, were sent to the Istituto Centrale del Restauro, the Central Institute of Restoration in Rome, where a first restoration was attempted. The head of a warrior in one of the scenes of the Judgment of St. James was pieced together and exhibited in 1947 at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, in a show that was entitled Warstall of Italian Art, an exhibition that was promoted by the American Committee for the Restoration of Italian Monuments. After that, the boxes containing the fragments of this chapel remained in Rome for many, many years. But by law in Italy, every work of art, major or minor, every fragment of a work of art has to be catalogued by the superintendencies. So by law, on the 50th anniversary of the end of the war, these fragments had to be, these boxes had to be opened and the fragments had to be catalogued. In this case, this was the beginning of an interesting story. The superintendent in Padua asked that the boxes be returned to Padua. She was responding to a general tendency of those years, of the early 90s, where local superintendencies wanted to be more independent from the capital, from Rome. She also, I believe, understood the significance of this work of art, although in pieces, for the town of Padua. It's a story that has a sort of a happy ending from the destruction, kind of a happy ending for grown-ups, not the kind of children like. We'll never see the frescoes back on the walls of the chapel. I don't want you to be disappointed at the end of this lecture. But it's like a kind of, it's a ray of hope in the indestructible, resourceful thrust of the human intellect, who, in the face of the worst destruction, could pick up the pieces and figure something out, figure out something to do with these pieces. The human intellect in this story is it's not an abstract entity, it's two people. Domenico Togliolo, who is a professor of physics at the University of Padua, and a young mathematician called Massimo Fornasier, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Vienna. So, when the boxes arrived in Padua, I'll show you what they look like. So it wasn't exactly, it was quite demoralizing. And this was a result, probably, of an early systematization, as it were, done in the Istituto Centrale del Restauro. But it was smashed rock, really. There was very little that was recognizable. Very few faces, very few hands. There's a time-honored rumor in Padua that if you looked into the well-appointed houses Padua you might find a head or two by Mantegna. It's a gossip. We'll leave it at that, but it is true that there are very, very few significant, beautiful pieces there.
How many boxes are there?
The number of boxes was 115. The number of fragments is around 80,000. To give you an idea, the entire surface of the chapel was about 300 square meters. The total surface that these fragments covered is 77 meters, so it's roughly 1/3. The rest was, if you want to believe it, that it was looted, but it was simply pulverized just by the explosion, by the fall. There was also, I should mention that in those days, during the war, there was a bus terminal in front of the church. So any buses might have just run over the pile of rubble. So what looked like this was once a very beautiful chapel. To give you an idea of where to place this chapel chronologically, the Ovetari Chapel was contemporary of Piero della Francesca's cycle in Arezzo. For those of you who may have seen The English Patient, you may remember that scene where the Indian sapper takes the nurse flying above and looking at the frescoes. What is remarkable about this chapel is that it had a very important, it was very important for the history of art in Italy. It was a Renaissance work of art, but as you know, the Renaissance had its cradle in Florence. Padua was somewhat, at the time, very far from the epicenter of the new movement. But for reasons that I'll explain in a minute, the artists who worked on the decoration of the chapel were all exposed to the lesson of the Florentines. As Keith Christensen, who's curator of European paintings in the Metropolitan Museum of New York, wrote, the frescoes of the Ovetari Chapel marked the advent of Renaissance painting in northern Italy. The contract for the decoration of the chapel was signed on the 16th of May, 1448, so smack in the center, in the middle of Princeton. At his death, Antonio Ovetari, who was a Paduan notary, willed 700 ducats, which were to be the revenue of the sale of the plot of land he left. He left this money for the decoration of the chapel. And the chapel would be decorated with scenes from the lives of St. Christopher and St. James, two saints who share the same feast day, which is 25th of July, according to the Oxford Dictionary of Saints. I'm going to show you what, don't be fooled, this doesn't exist, this is a virtual reconstruction done by a man called Mario Zara, who's another fan of the chapel as well. So this was the chapel. It was going to be frescoed. All this area that you see, either side, either walls, the ceiling, and behind the altar. Antonio Ovetari's widow, who was called Imperatrice, which in Italian means empress, hired two teams of artists. And the choice was very interesting. These are other images. These frescoes have been, they don't, if you go to Padua today, you won't see them. They are just, it's a computerized image. It's just to give you an idea of what it would have looked like. It's the scene of the Assumption. So she hired two teams of artists. Giovanni d'Alemagna and Antonio Vivarini were representative of the Gothic style, which was the old school of painting in those days. Their partners were Niccolo Pizzolo and Andrea Mantegna, who was 17 at the time when he started. And as you will see, the Ovetari Chapel is a troubled story from the beginning, well before the 1944 bombing. Its decoration was to be completed in 2 years, by 1450. A series of mishaps extended the work to 1457, which is the last date, the date of the last payment to Andrea Mantegna. This series of accidents ultimately worked in favor of the young Mantegna. In 1450, Giovanni d'Alemagna died suddenly, and his friend Antonio Vivarini, as a result of that, quit work in the Ovetari the following year, 1451. Niccolò Pizzolo had been Donatello's assistant in Padua. Donatello, the Tuscan sculptor, had worked in Padua for 10 years and had brought Renaissance with him. There had been an influx of artists in Padua and Venice, called by the Republic of Venice first. And then Paolo Cello was one, Andrea del Castagno, Filippo Lippi. So in this kind of crucible of all the new ideas that was the Ovetari, Niccolò Pizzolo represented the link to the Tuscan artists. Unfortunately, according to Vasari, he was more keen on the use of arms than on the practice of painting. He was a troublemaker, foul-tempered, and so was Andrea Mantegna, who later on, when he was living in Mantua, is believed to have hired thugs to beat up his competitors. So the relationship between these two artists was not meant to be. They were temperamentally incompatible. A judge had to step in to separate the two artists. Apparently, the work had been proceeding very slowly because of arguments between the two artists. They were barring access to light for each other, access to the scaffolding. So somebody actually had to divide them. And then in 1453, Niccolò Pizzolo, while he was walking home one night, was killed, apparently ambushed by a rival artist. Don't work with it wasn't so, with brief exceptions, possibly two scenes in the chapel, Andrea Mantegna was left the sole painter, sole artist working in the Ovetari. Yet his troubles were far from over. In February of 1457, a quarrel with Imperatrice Ovetari brought them in front of the judge, because Imperatrice was mad at Mantegna because he had only painted 8 disciples instead of the 12 he had painted. So again, they had to call arbiters in, and other painters who, one in particular, Piero da Milano, defended Mantegna and said that he well deserved the money that he was paid for the 8 disciples, and there might have been an artistic reason for that, not an economic one, or laziness. The previous year, on the 2nd of January 1456, Andrea Mantegna had appeared in yet another court, this time for the judgment that disenfranchised him from the patronage of his master, Francesco Squarcione. Andrea Mantegna was born probably in 1430 or 1431, the son of a carpenter named Biagio, in Isola di Carturo, which is a small village near Padua, and entered as an apprentice the workshop of Francesco Squarcione in Padua. Francesco Squarcione was the most prominent painter in Padua at the time. And he was a singular figure of artist, teacher, would also been a tailor and embroiderer. As Millard Meese wrote about him, he was notorious for his enormous reputation and small accomplishments. And he was ever controversial. Chastel called him a charlatan, the Italian art historian Giuseppe Fiocco the anti-master. And recent scholars have really tried to redeem him and rid him of this terrible reputation. There's very little work extant by Squarcione. And it's a little hard to let go of this fantastic villain in the story, because between him and Mantegna, it's like a Mozart-Salieri relationship. The mediocre master, and yet shrewd, well-connected, and the extremely talented pupil. however we feel, however scholars feel about Squarcione, he provided a student, a pupil of genius with the tools of his art. Squarcione loved the ancient world, had traveled to Greece, and had brought back fragments, statues, Roman statues, Greek statues from Greece, from his trips, which he had his pupils copy as a way of learning painting. He filled his workshop with these works. Andrea's response to these ancient pieces was enthusiastic, and in fact his love of antiquity was one that was going to remain for all of it, to be one of the marks of his painting. It wasn't just the pleasure of scattering a fragment of a column in a painting or an arch. It was a deep longing for a kind of equilibrium that the ancient world seemed to represent for him. Andrea was also liked to keep company with scholars from the University of Padua. He loved the company of poets, of antiquarians, lover of the ancient world. And there is an intellectual quality to his work, to his paintings, that has always appealed to writers across the centuries. Squarcione had a practice of adopting his students, his pupils. Apparently, he adopted 137 in his career, and Andrea Mantegna was one of them. There was obviously an economic reason behind this. Pupils had to give their master their earnings from their jobs. And at some point, Andrea Mantegna felt way too exploited and decided to liberate himself and leave Squarcione's workshop. Squarcione got back at him. He was called in by the ever-suspicious Imperatrice Ovetari, who wanted an opinion on the work in progress in the Ovetari. And Squarcione criticized Mantegna's frescoes. According to Vasari, they were not a good thing, he said, because in painting them, he had imitated figures made out of ancient marble. And he went on saying that they lacked the supple quality of human flesh. Evidently, he knew where to strike Andrea Mantegna. Again, according to Vasari, these reproaches stung Andrea's heart. But they were also beneficial to his art in the long run. He probably reacted to a bad review like a man who was upset for a while and then moved on. Andrea may also have taken his revenge. There's a figure of an ugly and fat soldier in one of the scenes, and it's beginning to be Francisco Squarcione. Like every artist of genius, Andrea understood and breathed the change in the air. He gravitated outside of Squarcione's workshop and towards Venice and the workshop of the Bellinis, a family of painters. Jacopo was Bellini, the father, who was an artist still steeped in the Gothic tradition, and his two sons, Gentile and Giovanni. Giovanni especially was the one who was really going to transform the lesson of the Florentine Renaissance into something uniquely northern, and was master of color, and probably very close to Andrea in sensitiveness. Andrea Mantegna married the Giovanni and Gentile's sister, Nicolosa, in 1453. As an aside, we know nothing about Nicolosa, as it should be for a woman in those days. It was good women were supposed not to be talked about. As a daughter, sister, wife of artists, she was certainly a woman of good taste. She bore Andrea many children, who all grew up to become hard-working, mediocre painters. So, at a very young age, the Ovetari Chapel became for Andrea Mantegna the stage of his coming of age as an artist. It was what has been described as the luminous prelude of a glorious career. And it was indeed the work that got him an invitation by the Marquis of Mantua, Ludovico Gonzaga, to go to Mantua and become a painter, an invitation which Andrea accepted, and in Mantua was going to live the rest of his life with brief interruptions. So, to go back to our box, this was far from luminous when they opened it. As I said, it was about 80,000 fragments. They came back to Padua, and the people involved in this decided to take whatever they were going to do, one step at a time. First, they cleaned the fragments. Of course, they had to find a place that was big enough to work to spread all these pieces, and they used the Royal Villa in Stra, just outside Padua, where these pieces were scattered on the floor. And Michela Gottardo, who was one of the restorers of this small Rome-based company that cleaned the pieces, described it as a sea of color. She said it was a sea of emeralds and golds and silver. The fragments were individually washed, cleaned in deionized water. They only wanted to clean the dust of remember that they had been closed in these boxes for 50 years. They didn't want to touch anything else that could have offered significant information for possible restoration. The work was done at record speed. In 2 months, 6 or 7 people, restorers, perched on stools around ping pong tables, cleaned these pieces, and then they had to number them. And that in itself was a little story. They couldn't find an ink or a pen that would work on the fragments. Either the ink disappeared after a while, or the stone was too porous and absorbed it too deeply. Finally, they found a kind of market standard makes. They said the standard should be the sponsor of this restoration. They put $30,000 worth of markers to number them. So what they did, on the back of each individual fragment, they wrote the number of the fragment, the number of the tray which contained it, and then subsequently the number of the box. So it's the letter of the tray. At this point, the fragments were divided by color, which at the time seemed to be the only possible criterion. The subsequent step was that photographing them. 2 art photographers in Padua, Mauro Magliani and Barbara Piovan, photographed all the fragments. And I'd like to insert a personal note. It was Barbara Piovan, who's an old friend of mine, who first pointed me in the direction of this story. I met her one day, and she said, I just photographed 8 fragments of the Ovetari Chapel. You wouldn't believe it. And she explained to me how they had done it. And the way they did it shows that they already had a plan in mind. The idea of a virtual restoration was born of a conversation between the superintendent, Maria Spiazzi, and Antoniolo, a professor of physics. He said, well, if you have to photograph them on glass. So the same image can give you the front, which gives the painted part of the fresco. And then the one you've seen before, the back, gives you the color, the number. These photographs were then transferred on CD-ROM, and they became what they call a digital catalog. This would allow restorers not to conduct a virtual restoration without physically touching the pieces again. In fact, the actual fragments are locked away somewhere, probably in the bishopric of Padua, but they are not being touched anymore. And the whole work is done on these photographs. What Domenico Tognolo and Fornazier and 2 other people working with them at the time, what they had in mind was a virtual restoration of the fragments. They were going to attempt to apply scientific calculation to to the solution of an artistic problem. And what is truly original, the truly original aspect of this project is the mathematical structure that supports it. In the early stages of the work, a lot of time was devoted by then to problems of method. If you think as a painting that falls violently and is scattered into pieces, the idea of a puzzle technique sort of intuitively comes to mind when you put the pieces back together. Unfortunately, in this case, there are too few fragments remaining. So the possibility that one fragment will have a neighbor is very unlikely. It's what they told me that mathematicians call an eliminatory explosion. And I think that fragments have had enough explosions on their own without that. The selection based on shape was also impossible because these fragments, while falling, had very jarred frayed margins. So shape would not be an indication. The third, and possibly the worst problem that the restorers had to face was that they were going to have a digital image in the computer on which to reposition the fragments. So finding good photographs of the frescoes was key. The frescoes had been photographed in 1943, 1 year exactly before the bombing. But the originals for those photographs were nowhere to be found. These were color photographs. All that was available were photographs taken by Eremitani, the Florence-based art photographers, dating from 1900 to 1920, in black and white. Very good quality photographs, but from 1920. So Professor Pignolo said, we recreated the 1900 photographer by translating our photographs on CD-ROM in what we came to call the Ilaria Dagnini. In other words, they took the black and white photographs and reinvented the colors on a range of gray tones that would correspond and that would allow the color fragments to match the black and white photographs. And to make matters even more difficult, if possible, the 1900-1920 images had photographed frescoes at that particular moment in their life, but then these had gone on for another 20 years and suffered bombing. So there was a physical difference between these and the photographs. To give you an example, the Basilica in Assisi that was destroyed, was frescoed by Giotto, was destroyed by an earthquake recently. It was a major disaster, but there they have very recent, very accurate photographs, needless to say color photographs. And they were able to pick up the pieces systematically as they fell. So they basically just reposition, not just, I mean, they're doing a great job, but they are repositioning the pieces on enlargements of the photographs. Here, they had next to nothing to work on. But as Pignolo says, we're scientists and the field of physics is the problems that suggest the solutions, which is something I always like to hear. And they started with what they called the 1,000 pieces test. They chose one scene. This is the scene of St. James in front of the emperor. And they just started trying out the method and see what would come out. With the help of an algorithm, the computer is capable of calculating the position of the fragment on its corresponding image with satisfying accuracy. This particular algorithm is called the circular harmonics. They found it on the net. And it's an interesting coincidence. The person who had worked on it was somebody working at MIT, but from Padua, called Matteo Frigo. Just coincidence. This algorithm is capable of memorizing the orientation, of recognizing and memorizing the orientation of the piece. This is how it sort of decomposes the chord comes out slowly. She's a little head. So the algorithm sort of rotates the piece on all the possible positions on the fresco and finds the one that has the highest likelihood of correspondence. The fragment, what let's say, this is a tray of fragments. The software takes out a piece and then cuts out, because the margins are so thin. You see, a circular shape is cut out to enclose as much significant information about the fragment as possible, but leaving out what restorers call disturbance, which is scratching, or all the information is recorded on another level. So we have, and then after it has cut out the piece, it hands it over to the algorithm. The calculation takes 2 to 3 minutes, and the computer answer offers a range of possibilities, from the likeliest to the unlikeliest. And a set of answers that says yes, it does correspond, no, yes, but, no, but, and no. The result is then checked by an operator. Sometimes the computer, it's their experience that the human eye and the computer complement each other very, very well. There are certain things that the human eye will never observe, and the computer will catch, and vice versa. And sometimes can make mistakes. As of June of 2002, the total yes fragments were 789. And the law says if a fragment is there, we'll put it back. This is another case which is sweet. You may recognize it. You see this little thing. It's not very significant. I mean, you can see that this is a finger, but that is some black lines. It was repositioned, found its mates, as it were, that it had lost 50 years ago, or 60 years ago. It's 3 birds in the background of the scene. Way up there. I mean, it's not very good resolution. It's much clearer than that photograph. But to give an example of what probably you know, but never. It may look a little, compared, but think of what's left and of the odds that they have to face. So the project of the restoration is to reposition all the fragments that have survived. They started with one scene, they moved on to the next, and then go on, as long as they'll have fragments that keep working. A bank, the Casa di Risparmio di Padua, Vigo, through its foundation, the Casa di Risparmio has always been very active in supporting the restoration and conservation of art in the Venetian area. They are the sponsors of the project. And I should say that in the early stages of this project, the restorers, Professor Pagnolo, and they worked nights in the basement of the Department of Physics, borrowing a computer from the Institute without any money. Said it would cost nothing. They just did it. But now, through the Casa di Risparmio and its foundation, they were able to open the Laboratorio Mantegna, it's called the Mantegna Lab, in Padua, with 12 computers and 31 people working. It's mostly students from art history, from the University of Padua, Venice and Udine. They work in shifts, and the daily average of fragments examined is about 800 to 850, with the notable exception of the month of February, which in Italian universities is exam season. So the productivity of the students has decreased dramatically that month. But it's quite exciting when they find a piece, when the computer gives a position that is very, very likely to be the right one. It's like screaming goes up, and they're really, really excited. So this is Professor Pagnolo's dream come true, to create a team of both art historians and restorers and scientists working together, and the possibility to offer students a practical application and working on Mantegna, no less, not just any piece. As I said at the start, we'll never see these frescoes back on the walls of the Ovetari again. If you go visit Padua, what you see is 3 scenes which were detached from the walls before, well before. In fact, they were detached in 1880 because the damage was damaging the frescoes. So 2 scenes and the scene of the Assumption. That's all there is on the walls right now. So repositioning them, reinstalling them on the walls has never been their objective. But what they've done is something that was born out of scientific curiosity and turned into something extremely interesting. I'll give you one example of one result they had. It was quite unexpected. The colors. All that knew these frescoes, knew them, who hadn't seen these frescoes before they were destroyed, and knew them from pictures. And it turned out, for instance, that a shield that was believed to be green is violet, and they're beginning to think that they can actually remap the colors based on what they're finding. And on the subject of color, since we're talking about a painter, I'd like to read to you what Bernard Berenson, the art historian, wrote in his diary in an entry dated March 16, 1944, and then I'll finish. Hullabaloo over bomb that fell plumb on the York Chapel of the Eremitani Padua. Few can regret their destruction more than I do, and I hope that early reports are exaggerated for propaganda purposes. But even if it is a fact, I would not weep my eyes out. They were not over-suitable for the space they covered, and their coloring was not harmonious. The best in them can be enjoyed in the highly satisfactory photographs of them that now exist, with an abundance of detail. Now, the thing with that, technically it was wrong, because the photographs are not very good. So what these people have created is a sort of interdisciplinary approach to the restoration of a lost work of art. A group of scientists working with art historians, restorers, and conservators, all bringing their specific competence to bear on an extremely difficult problem. What they've done is truly, I believe, a renaissance in its inspiration. And I love to think that if Mantegna were alive, he would love to hang out with these guys. Thank you for reminding me. They're very small. That's another problem. The 90% of the fragments are 2 inches. That's another unlucky fact.
If by some accident there were enough pieces that could fit together to make an image, let's say a face or something recognizable, do you think that they might put it together and display it in the museum?
That's a possibility. That's a possibility. There are a number of possibilities. They might decide to put on one scene. I forgot to show you. This is not the final result, but you see, this is the scene, and the little dots are the fragments. So, not much. They found some more. This is not a current image. This is from several months ago, but you get an idea. So, they might decide to put one scene on the wall, as an example of the work that's being done, rather than try and reconstruct the entire chapel with photographs. Yes, the chapel was reconstructed right away, almost right away. That was the kind of work that they did. The Americans, this commission that I mentioned at the beginning did. They made sure when there was a roof missing or a wall that was threatening to fall, they made sure that it wouldn't fall and just reinforce those structures so that no further damage would
How many of the 80,000 pieces have they actually put
into this scene?
Into position?
But it's one thing what they reposition how much they examine. I know by now they have repositioned about 800 pieces. And they're working very fast. I mean, you have to think when they started. First of all, they weren't even sure whether the method was good or not. They are very low-key people, but they kept a particularly low profile in the beginning because it was an experiment, really. And now they feel quite confident in the method. But and then the computer technology has improved, so it's much faster now. So, but they say that it's 10% more than what they had expected.
Is there financing for this project, or are they all volunteers?
The bank. No. The bank is financing the lab, paying, I think, a little salary to the students. Professor Tognolo doesn't want a penny for his work. But yes, it's not. This is something that I really like to stress. They wanted to do it for the love of it. And when it comes to the students, they want to make sure that these young people are happy. But they just don't believe it. They actually say that if you use your intelligence, well, you need very little money. Refreshing to hear. This is certainly what they do.
Go back to the chapel that now stands. Is it just all white inside?
Mostly white, with the two scenes that were detached before the bombing.
Oh, okay.
That's it.
I have a recollection of something of Montaigne in that chapel, right?
Yes, these are the two scenes that I just, there are two scenes that were detached, right, as you go in to your right. Those are the scenes that were detached from the walls before the war, because they were damaged. They were taken to the church of San Antonio, and there they stayed. So when the chapel was bombed, they were not there. They were reinstalled on the walls after the war. They're very damaged. Trying to see these two, the lower scenes, are on the walls. As you see, there's a lot of damage, but that's previous damage.
Has there been a call out to the Italian or other tourists who went with their own cameras and they have other pictures?
I know at the time they did, there was also a call to return the pieces. That led to nothing. The priest of the Church of the Eremitani told me that he said, no questions asked, just return them. It's been a very long time. They might have ended up on the art market.
There's another thing that just occurred to me. Several times a year, the major auction houses in New York have what they call the Grand Tour and the English Country House. And when I've seen these exhibits over the years, there are always bits and pieces that are interesting and are not high priced because There are bits and pieces, but the English gentleman always collected and brought things back, and they put them in their country houses. So that's a combination.
I think the fact that they've worked so, they've kept such a low profile, they have had so far very little contact. And in fact, outside Italy, it's the first time that somebody talks about it. And in Italy itself, Tognolo and Fornazieri have spoken at a couple of symposia, and that was it. So maybe, yes, if word gets out. I'm working on an article on this story, so maybe that would be very appreciated. Something maybe, just knowing about it.
As far as you know, are other restorers, art historians using the same computer method to put together?
No.
No? Is this the first time?
Yeah, this is the first time for two reasons. Because of the uniqueness of the problem. Thank God, I mean, this is the only really pulverized work of art that I So it's like a custom-tailored restoration. And B, generally restorers are restorers, and mathematicians are mathematicians. It's rare that a scientist, in fact, I don't think scientists
That I know.
Yeah.
IBM in Egypt
Yes.
used that same system to rebuild the Egyptian blocks. And because after the death of one pharaoh, they destroyed all of his monuments. And they used them inside out for the others. And what they did was use a system like this. I think Nova or one of these PBS programs had something on it. It was fascinating because they did use the system of identifying IBM.
Were there any books published prior to 1944 that anybody photographed these and put in the
Yes.
books?
There's a book called The Chapel Ovetari. It's also, I believe, translated in English by York that had the entire chapel photographed in color. These are the photographs that are missing. The originals are missing. But yes, they are photographed. They're not very good photographs, but they